The gentle hum of jet engines filled the air as the Thompson family made their way through Atlanta International Airport's bustling terminals. They were returning from what had been a perfect Caribbean getaway. 7 days of crystal-clear waters, sandy beaches, and precious family moments captured in countless photos on their phones. Mr. Thompson, dressed in comfortable traveling clothes, a navy blue polo shirt and well-worn jeans, looked just like any other dad heading home from vacation. No one would have guessed he was a seasoned FBI agent with 15 years of experience in counterterrorism operations. His wife walked beside him, wearing a flowing summer dress, while their teenage daughter and young son trailed behind, still chatting about their last morning at the beach. The family had deliberately chosen an early morning flight to avoid crowds, but the airport was surprisingly busy for 7 a.m. The air conditioning fought against the Georgia summer heat, creating a comfortable coolness that was a stark contrast to the tropical warmth they'd left behind just hours ago. Their daughter was showing her little brother something on her phone, probably the video of him trying to surf for the first time. A moment that had the whole family laughing for days. Mrs. Thompson smiled at the memory, adjusting her carry-on bag as they made their way to baggage claim. The vacation had been exactly what they needed. A break from the intensity of Mr. Thompson's work schedule and the kids' busy school year. As they approached the baggage carousel, Mr. Thompson noticed how his son's eyes lit up at the sight of the moving belt, still finding fascination in the simple mechanics even after many family trips. Their daughter, now a teenager, pretended to be too cool for such childish entertainment, but she still watched intently as the first bags started appearing. The family stood together, a perfect picture of vacation's end, tired but happy, ready to head home, but holding onto those last precious moments of family time. Mr. Thompson had just spotted their first suitcase, the bright blue one with the small scuff mark from their previous trip, when he noticed 2 airport police officers walking purposefully in their direction. His trained eye caught the subtle details, the officers' slightly tense postures, their focused gazes, the way they positioned themselves to approach from different angles. Years of FBI experience had taught him to read these signs, but he never imagined he'd need these skills while standing with his family at baggage claim. The warm, peaceful mood of their homecoming was about to shift dramatically. As the officers drew closer, Mr. Thompson instinctively moved closer to his family, not out of fear, but from the protective instinct that had served him well both as a federal agent and as a father. He could feel the change in the air, like the sudden pressure drop before a storm. Their daughter was the first to notice something was wrong. She lowered her phone, her laughter fading as she caught sight of the approaching officers. Her little brother, still babbling about wanting to try parasailing on their next vacation, hadn't noticed yet. Mrs. Thompson's hand found her husband's, a silent gesture they'd perfected over years of partnership. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to grow harsher, and the casual chatter of fellow travelers faded into background noise as the officers closed the final few steps toward them. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, knowing that how he handled the next few moments would be crucial. Not just for his family's safety, but for what this encounter might represent in the larger conversation about law enforcement and racial profiling in America. Standing there, he was no longer just an FBI agent, no longer just a father returning from vacation. He was about to become part of a story that would ripple far beyond this moment in Atlanta International Airport, though none of them knew it yet. The sight of their second suitcase appearing on the carousel would be the last normal moment of what had started as a perfectly ordinary Monday morning. The first officer cleared his throat, his hand resting casually near his belt. "Excuse me, folks," he said, his voice carrying that practiced authority that all law enforcement seemed to share. "We need to have a word with you." The second officer had already positioned himself slightly to the side, creating what Mr. Thompson recognized as a standard containment formation. "Is there a problem, officer?" Mr. Thompson asked, keeping his voice steady and calm. He could feel his wife's hand tighten around his, while their children moved instinctively closer. Around them, other travelers were beginning to take notice, some slowing their pace to watch the scene unfold, others hurrying past with averted eyes. "We've had a report of a theft in one of the terminal shops," the first officer stated, his eyes scanning over the family's luggage. "Your family matches a description we received." The words hung in the air like heavy smoke, their implication clear to everyone within earshot. Mr. Thompson felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach, not fear, but a deep, weary understanding of what was truly happening. He'd been on both sides of this situation during his career, but standing here with his family made it entirely different. Their son tugged at his mother's sleeve, confusion written across his young face. "Mom, what's going on?" he whispered, loud enough for the officers to hear. "Sir, if you could step over here with me," the second officer said, gesturing to a less crowded area. "Ma'am, you and the children can wait by the seating area." His tone left no room for discussion, though it was technically phrased as a request. Mrs. Thompson straightened her spine, years of dealing with similar situations evident in her composed response. "We prefer to stay together as a family, officer," she said firmly but politely. Their daughter had already pulled out her phone, holding it low but steady, a gesture that spoke volumes about growing up in an era where documentation could mean the difference between safety and danger. The first officer's expression hardened slightly. "Ma'am, we're conducting an official investigation. We need to question each of you separately." His hand moved slightly closer to his belt, a subtle movement that Mr. Thompson immediately noticed. Around them, the airport continued its constant motion, but their small section of baggage claim had become its own universe. More travelers were stopping now, phones appearing in hands, recording what was quickly becoming a scene. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on everyone's faces, making the moment feel even more surreal. "Officers," Mr. Thompson began, maintaining eye contact with the first officer, "I understand you're doing your job. However, I'd like to show you some identification that might help clear this up quickly." He moved his hand slowly toward his back pocket, making sure both officers could see his movements clearly. The second officer tensed visibly. "Sir, keep your hands where we can see them," he commanded, his voice rising slightly. This drew even more attention from passersby, and the circle of onlookers grew wider. Their daughter's voice shook slightly as she spoke up. "Dad wasn't even near any shops. We just got off our flight." Her phone was still recording, capturing every word, every movement. Their son had gone quiet, his earlier vacation excitement replaced by a stillness that no child should have to learn. Another airport police officer was approaching now, radio crackling at his shoulder. The situation was escalating exactly the way Mr. Thompson had seen countless times before. But this time, his family was at the center of it. The weight of his FBI credentials in his back pocket felt heavier than ever, but he knew the next few moments would require careful handling. Mrs. Thompson stood tall, one arm around their son, her other hand still firmly gripping her husband's. Years of marriage to a federal agent had taught her the delicate dance of these situations. When to speak, when to stay quiet, how to be strong without being confrontational. But this was different. This time, it wasn't about her husband's work. This was about their family being seen as suspects simply because of how they looked. The air in the baggage claim area grew thicker with tension as more officers approached, and Mr. Thompson knew they were reaching a critical moment. What happened next would either diffuse the situation or turn this into something that would be all over the evening news. The choice, he realized, wasn't entirely in his hands anymore. The tension in the air grew thicker as more officers arrived at the scene. The baggage claim area, usually just a brief stop in a traveler's journey, had become an unwilling stage for what was unfolding. The constant whir of the baggage carousel provided an oddly dramatic background noise to the scene. "Last time, sir, step over here with me," the first officer demanded, his patience clearly wearing thin. Around them, the crowd of onlookers had grown, their phones raised like silent witnesses to the escalating situation. An elderly couple shook their heads in disapproval, while a group of business travelers whispered among themselves. Mr. Thompson fought back the rising frustration in his chest. As an FBI agent, he'd been trained to handle high-pressure situations, but watching his family being treated this way tested every ounce of his professional composure. "Officer, I understand protocol, but separating my family isn't necessary. If you just allow me to." "Dad," their daughter's voice quivered slightly as she continued recording. "They can't do this, right?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications that no parent ever wants their child to understand. Their son had pressed himself against his mother's side, his earlier vacation excitement completely forgotten. Mrs. Thompson, still holding her ground with quiet dignity, spoke up. "Officers, we've just returned from a family vacation. We have all our boarding passes, hotel receipts, everything to prove where we've been. There's been a mistake." Her voice remained steady, but those who knew her well could hear the controlled anger beneath her calm exterior. A third officer, wearing sergeant's stripes, approached the scene. "What seems to be the holdup here?" he asked, looking between his officers and the family. Before anyone could respond, the airport's morning announcements crackled over the speakers, a jarringly normal intrusion into this tense moment. These individuals matched the description of suspects in a retail theft, the first officer reported, maintaining his authoritative stance. "They're refusing to comply with questioning procedures." The son's voice, small but clear, cut through the tension. "But we just got off the plane. How could we have stolen anything?" The simple logic of a child's question hung in the air, making several onlookers nod in agreement. Mrs. Thompson pulled her son closer, her protective instinct visible in every movement. The family's luggage sat forgotten on the carousel, making its third round now. Their daughter's phone battery indicator blinked red, but she kept recording, her hand trembling slightly but determined. "Look," Mr. Thompson started again, his voice taking on an edge of professional authority that he developed over years of federal service. "This situation is escalating unnecessarily. I'm going to reach for my ID very slowly." He kept his movements deliberate and telegraphed, aware that every eye in the vicinity was focused on him. The sergeant stepped forward, hand raised. "Sir, we've asked you multiple times to comply with our officers. Your continued resistance is only making this situation worse." The original officers moved closer, creating a tighter circle around the family. A young woman in the crowd called out, "They haven't done anything wrong. This is ridiculous." Her voice sparked murmurs of agreement from other onlookers. The public attention was growing, with more phones recording the scene from various angles. Mrs. Thompson's eyes met her husband's, years of shared experiences allowing them to communicate without words. She knew he could end this quickly by revealing his FBI credentials, but she also understood why he was hesitating. This moment was bigger than just their family now. Their daughter, still filming, spoke quietly to her brother. "It's okay," she whispered, though her own voice betrayed her uncertainty. "Dad knows what to do." The boy nodded, but his grip on his mother's hand tightened. The first officer moved to separate the family, reaching for Mr. Thompson's arm. "Sir, this is your last warning. Step away from your family and come with me." The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to grow harsher, casting stark shadows across everyone's faces. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. In the background, more airport security personnel were arriving, their radios crackling with static and coded messages. The crowd of observers had grown larger, their presence adding another layer of pressure to an already volatile situation. Mr. Thompson knew the next few seconds would determine how this story ended. As a federal agent, he'd been in countless high-stakes situations, but none had felt quite as personal as this one. His family's safety, his professional identity, and a larger social issue were all converging in this single moment under the unforgiving airport lights. The daughter's hands trembled slightly as she continued filming, but her determination remained steady. Through her phone's screen, she watched the scene unfold like a movie she never wanted to be part of. Her brother's quiet sniffles beside her made her heart ache, but she knew she needed to keep recording. Years of dinner table conversations about civil rights and the importance of documentation had prepared her for this moment, though she'd never expected to use these lessons during their family vacation's end. "Young lady, you need to put that phone away," one of the officers commanded, noticing her recording. The girl's mother stepped slightly in front of her, a subtle but clear protective gesture. "She has every right to record," her mother stated firmly, though her voice carried a slight tremor that only her family would notice. Years of teaching her children about their rights suddenly felt very real in this moment. "We're in a public space." The youngest family member, still clutching his sister's free hand, watched with wide eyes as more travelers gathered around them. Some were shaking their heads, others were pulling out their own phones to record. He noticed a little girl about his age in the crowd, staring at him with a confused expression while her parents whispered to each other and pointed. "This is what we're going to do," the surgeon announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the growing crowd. "We're going to escort each of you to separate questioning rooms. This is standard procedure." He gestured to two female officers who had just arrived on the scene. The daughter's phone beeped. Low battery warning. She quickly switched to power-saving mode, knowing she couldn't let the recording stop now. Her brother pressed closer to her side, and she could feel him shaking slightly. "I want to stay with Mom," the boy said, his voice small, but clear in the tense atmosphere. The words seemed to hang in the air, making several onlookers shift uncomfortably. A woman in business attire near them wiped her eyes quickly. One of the female officers stepped toward Mrs. Thompson. "Ma'am, please come with me. Your daughter can go with Officer Chen, and your son with Officer Roberts." Her tone was gentler than the male officers, but the authority remained unmistakable. The daughter felt her mother's hand squeeze her shoulder. Through her phone's screen, she watched her father's expression, the same calm, controlled look he always had when handling serious situations, but she could see the muscle twitching in his jaw, a telltale sign of his contained anger. "My children aren't going anywhere without us," Mrs. Thompson declared, her teacher's voice coming through, the one she used when there was no room for argument. "They're minors, and you have no right to separate them from us without cause." The chaos of the airport continued around them. Announcements overhead, the beeping of passing luggage carts, distant plane engines. But in their little bubble of tension, every small sound seemed magnified. The daughter could hear her brother's rapid breathing, the rustle of her mother's dress as she stood her ground, the subtle crackle of the officers' radios. A newly arrived security guard spoke into his radio, "Situation at baggage claim 4, requesting additional support." The daughter zoomed her camera slightly, capturing the growing number of uniforms surrounding her family. Through her phone's screen, she watched an elderly man in the crowd step forward. "This is outrageous," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I've been watching this whole time. This family just got off a plane. How could they have stolen anything?" The brother tugged at his sister's sleeve. "Your phone's blinking," he whispered, pointing at the battery indicator flashing red. She nodded but kept recording. Their father had always told them that sometimes the most important moments in life needed to be documented, no matter what. More voices from the crowd joined in support. "Let them go. This is harassment. They're just a family." The daughter's camera captured it all: the growing crowd, the increasing number of officers, her father's rigid posture, her mother's protective stance, her brother's frightened but trusting eyes. The surgeon's radio crackled again, and he stepped aside to listen to something. The daughter noticed her father watching this interaction intently, his FBI training evident in his focused observation. She zoomed in slightly on the surgeon's face, noting how his expression changed as he listened to whatever was being said through his earpiece. The moment everything changed happened so smoothly, so professionally, that at first only those closest to the scene realized what was happening. Mr. Thompson, still maintaining his composed demeanor, slowly reached into his back pocket. His movements were deliberate, practiced, the kind that came from years of handling tense situations. "Sir, I'm telling you one last time," the lead officer started, but Mr. Thompson's voice cut through with quiet authority. "I'm reaching for my credentials," he said clearly, each word measured and calm. "I'm a federal agent." His hand emerged holding a familiar black leather wallet, one that his children had seen countless times on their father's dresser at home. The shift in the atmosphere was instant, like a sudden change in air pressure. The FBI credentials caught the fluorescent airport lighting, the gold badge gleaming as Mr. Thompson held it up. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the continued whir of the baggage carousel and the distant airport announcements. The sergeant stepped forward, squinting at the credentials. His face went through a rapid series of expressions: disbelief, realization, and then something that looked very much like concern. "You're with the Bureau?" he asked, his authoritative tone wavering slightly. Mrs. Thompson watched as the officer's postures changed. She'd seen this transformation many times before, the moment when people realized they'd made a serious error in judgment. Her arm remained protectively around their son, who was looking up at his father with a mixture of pride and relief. "Counterterrorism Division," Mr. Thompson confirmed, his voice now carrying the full weight of his position. 15 years of service. And yes, I'll be filing a full report about this incident. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The power had shifted completely. The daughter, still recording, captured the officers taking small steps backward, creating space where moments ago they had been closing in. Her phone's battery warning flashed again, but she knew this was the moment that mattered most. "Sir, we had a report," the first officer stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. The second officer had already stepped back completely, suddenly very interested in his shoes. The crowd of onlookers, which had grown considerably, began to murmur. Someone started clapping slowly, then others joined in. The sound echoed through the baggage claim area, drawing even more attention to the scene. The sergeant's radio crackled again, this time loud enough for everyone to hear. "Suspects in the retail theft have been apprehended at Terminal C." The timing couldn't have been more pointed, more damning of what had just transpired. Mr. Thompson tucked his credentials away, then finally allowed some of his controlled anger to show. "My family and I just returned from vacation. We weren't anywhere near your retail shops. Your officers profiled us, attempted to separate my minor children from their parents, and created a scene that traumatized my son. All of this could have been avoided with basic procedural courtesy." The son, still holding tight to his mother's hand, stood a little straighter. He'd seen his father at work events, had heard stories about his important job, but seeing him in action like this was different. It was like watching a superhero reveal their identity. Mrs. Thompson squeezed her daughter's shoulder gently. "Keep recording, sweetheart," she whispered. "This is important." The girl nodded, understanding that this moment was bigger than just their family. A new figure pushed through the crowd, a man in a suit who moved with the purposeful stride of senior management. "I'm the head of airport security," he announced, slightly out of breath. "We just got word about your identity, Agent. Please, let's move this conversation somewhere more private." But Mr. Thompson shook his head. "No, sir. What happened here happened in public. The resolution should be public too. These officers need to understand that this situation arose not from proper procedure, but from bias. And my children need to see how we handle this properly." The gathering crowd had grown silent, watching and listening. Parents held their children closer, business travelers had stopped checking their watches, and even the airport staff had paused their work to witness what was unfolding. The daughter's phone finally gave one last warning beep, but it didn't matter anymore. She'd captured enough. The truth of what had happened, and more importantly, what it meant, was already spreading through social media, through the witnesses' phones, through the stories that would be told and retold about this day. Within minutes, The whole atmosphere in the baggage claim area had transformed. The head of airport security was now frantically speaking into his phone, while several high-ranking officers hurried through the crowd. Mr. Thompson's FBI supervisor had been contacted and was already on his way to the airport. "Agent," the head of security tried again. "I'd assure you this isn't how we typically handle situations." Sweat beaded on his forehead under the harsh airport lights. Behind him, the original officers who had confronted the family stood awkwardly, their earlier authority deflated. Mr. Thompson straightened his polo shirt, a simple gesture that somehow carried more authority than any uniform. "Actually, I suspect this is exactly how you typically handle situations, and that's the problem." His voice remained measured, but carried a weight that made everyone listen. "I train law enforcement agencies on proper detention procedures and bias recognition. What happened here today will now become part of that training." Their daughter had finally lowered her phone, its battery completely drained, but dozens of other phones in the crowd continued recording. Mrs. Thompson noticed how some of the viewers were already typing rapidly on their phones, no doubt sharing the story on social media. A distinguished-looking man in a suit pushed through the crowd. "Agent," he called out, striding forward with purpose. "I just got the call. I'm the airport's chief of operations." He reached out to shake Mr. Thompson's hand, then turned to address the family. "Mrs. Thompson, children, I cannot express how deeply sorry we are for this incident." The son, still holding his mother's hand, watched the scene with wide eyes. He'd never seen so many important-looking people apologizing to his father before. The crowd had grown even larger, with some airport employees stopping to watch the unfolding scene. "Sorry isn't enough." Mrs. Thompson spoke up, her teacher's voice carrying clearly. "Our children just witnessed their family being profiled and nearly separated. How do you think that affects a child's sense of safety? Their trust in law enforcement?" The chief of operations nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right, ma'am. Which is why I want to assure you that this incident will lead to immediate changes in our training protocols." He glanced nervously at Mr. Thompson. "Perhaps, Agent, given your expertise, you might be willing to help develop those new protocols." Mr. Thompson finished for him. "Yes, I will. But not because you're asking. I'll do it because no family should experience what we just did." He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the boy's tension finally starting to ease. A woman emerged from the crowd, introducing herself as a local news reporter who happened to be at the airport. "Sir, would you be willing to share your story? I think it's important for people to hear about this incident from your unique perspective as both a father and a federal agent." Before Mr. Thompson could respond, his phone buzzed. "Excuse me," he said, checking the message. "That's my supervisor. He's at the main entrance." He turned to his family, his expression softening. "He's bringing a bureau car to take us home." The daughter, though her phone was dead, stood tall beside her mother. "Dad," she said quietly, "all those training videos you showed us about knowing our rights. I never thought we'd need them ourselves." The chief of operations was still talking, outlining immediate changes to security protocols, but Mrs. Thompson's attention was on her children. She saw how this incident had aged them somehow, made them more aware, more grown-up than they should have needed to be after a family vacation. The crowd began to thin as airport security finally started dispersing people. Some stopped to shake Mr. Thompson's hand or pat him on the shoulder. A few parents in the crowd made a point of making eye contact with his children, offering encouraging smiles. An older woman approached Mrs. Thompson, speaking softly. "You should be proud. Your family handled this with such dignity." She glanced at the children. "And these young ones, they're learning powerful lessons about standing up for what's right." As the FBI supervisor's arrival was announced over the radio, the original officers who had caused this situation stood to the side, their expressions a mix of embarrassment and realization. What had started as a routine profiling incident had transformed into a moment that would change airport security procedures and, more importantly, the lives of everyone who witnessed it. By early afternoon, the airport incident had spread across social media like wildfire. The family's living room, usually a quiet space for evening TV and homework, had become an impromptu command center. Mr. Thompson sat on their familiar brown couch, fielding calls from news organizations and civil rights groups, while Mrs. Thompson made tea in the kitchen, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. The daughter sat cross-legged on the floor, her phone now charged, watching her recording go viral. Local news stations had already picked up the story, and national networks were starting to call. "Dad," she called out between his calls. "The video has over 100,000 views already." The son had been unusually quiet since they got home, sitting in his favorite beanbag chair and hugging his vacation souvenir, a small stuffed dolphin from the Caribbean gift shop. Mrs. Thompson noticed his thoughtful expression as she brought in a tray of cookies and tea. "You okay, sweetie?" she asked, sitting beside him. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with questions that no child should have to ask. "Mom, if Dad wasn't FBI, what would have happened to us?" The question hung heavy in the air, making everyone in the room pause. Even Mr. Thompson lowered his phone, another news station left waiting on the line. Before anyone could answer, the doorbell rang. Through the front window, they could see several news vans parked along their usually quiet suburban street. Mrs. Thompson peeked through the curtains. "It's the airport's chief of police," she announced, "and he's not alone." Mr. Thompson opened the door to find not only the chief, but also several other high-ranking airport officials, all looking appropriately contrite. The airport's head of public relations clutched a folder of papers, while another man carried what appeared to be an official letter. "Agent Thompson," the chief began, his formal tone matching his pressed uniform, "we've come to personally deliver our official response to this morning's incident." He glanced at the news vans. "We wanted to reach you before we make our public statement." The family gathered in their living room, the familiar space now feeling like a stage. The son stayed close to his sister, who had started recording again. A new habit born from the morning's events. The chief cleared his throat. "Effective immediately, we're implementing a complete overhaul of our security training protocols. Every officer involved in today's incident has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." He turned to face the children directly. "What happened to your family today was wrong, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." The head of public relations stepped forward, opening her folder. "We're announcing a new training program, focusing on bias prevention and proper detention procedures." She looked at Mr. Thompson. "With your permission, sir, we'd like to use your daughter's video as part of this training. It's powerful." The daughter sat up straighter, surprised to be included in the official response. Her brother looked at her with newfound admiration. His big sister's quick thinking had made a real difference. Mrs. Thompson, still standing protectively near her children, spoke up. "And the officers who tried to separate our family? What happens to them?" The chief's expression turned serious. "They'll be required to complete extensive retraining before returning to duty. And," he hesitated, looking at the children, "we'd like your family to be part of that retraining. Your perspective, especially the children's, could help our officers understand the real impact of their actions." The son, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Will they learn that not everyone who looks different is bad?" The simple question from a child's perspective made several of the officials shift uncomfortably. Mr. Thompson put his hand on his son's shoulder. "That's exactly what they'll learn, buddy." He turned to the officials. "I accept your proposal, but with one condition. This training program needs to extend beyond just your airport. Other families, who don't have an FBI badge to protect them, deserve better." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the room as the officials nodded in agreement. Outside, more news vans were arriving, their satellite dishes reaching up into the sky. What had started as a family vacation ending in discrimination had transformed into something bigger, a moment of change, sparked by one family's dignity in the face of injustice. A month after the airport incident, the family's story had become more than just a viral video. Their living room wall now displayed framed newspaper clippings from major publications, each telling their story. The daughter's quick thinking with her phone camera had turned into something much bigger than anyone expected. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Mr. Thompson adjusted his tie, preparing for another day of special training sessions at the airport. Mrs. Thompson packed his lunch, just like any other day, but they both knew this wasn't just another day at work. "The officers from that day will be in today's session," he said quietly, checking his briefcase one last time. His wife paused, remembering how those same officers had tried to separate their family just weeks ago. "Are you going to show them my video, Dad?" their daughter asked from the breakfast table, where she was finishing her cereal. Since the incident, she joined several school committees focused on student rights and had started a blog about civil justice. "Yes, sweetheart. Your video is now part of the official training program." He smiled at her proudly. "Actually, it's been requested by police departments across the country." The son looked up from his homework, which he'd been struggling to finish before school. "Dad, remember that little girl at the airport? The one watching us? I saw her at the park yesterday." He paused, thinking. "She recognized me and told her mom I was the boy from the video who helped change things." Mrs. Thompson sat down at the table, her coffee cup warming her hands. "How did that make you feel, honey?" The boy thought for a moment. "Good, I guess. But also kind of sad that we had to change things in the first place." His simple wisdom made everyone at the table fall silent for a moment. The doorbell rang. It was the car from the FBI office. Since the incident, Mr. Thompson had been appointed to lead a new task force on law enforcement reform. His unique position as both an FBI agent and someone who had experienced profiling firsthand made him the perfect choice. "Will you be home for dinner?" Mrs. Thompson asked, helping him with his coat. The officers who were involved asked if they could come by to apologize to the kids personally. Mr. Thompson nodded. "I'll be there. Those officers, they're not bad people. They just needed to understand the impact of their actions." He kissed his wife goodbye and hugged both children. The daughter grabbed her backpack, ready for school. Her social studies teacher had asked her to give a presentation about the incident and its aftermath. The topic: how one moment can create change. "Mom," she said, checking her phone one last time before leaving. "There's a comment on the video from a police officer in another state. He says watching it made him change how he approaches his job." Her voice carried a mix of pride and responsibility. The son was packing up his homework when he suddenly asked, "Do you think people will remember what happened to us?" Mrs. Thompson knelt beside him. "They'll remember because we turned a bad experience into something positive. Your father is helping train people to be better. Your sister's video is teaching others. And you?" She smiled. "You're showing everyone that even kids can stand up for what's right." Outside, neighbors waved as they headed to their cars. The story had changed their quiet suburban street too. People who had never talked much before now stopped to chat, sharing their own experiences and discussing ways to make their community better. The morning news played quietly on the kitchen TV, showing a clip of Mr. Thompson speaking at a law enforcement conference. Change doesn't just happen. His voice came through clearly. It happens when we take difficult moments and turn them into opportunities to learn and grow. As the family prepared to head out for their day, the children to school, Mrs. Thompson to her teaching job, and Mr. Thompson to his training session, they each carried with them the knowledge that their story had become part of something bigger. What had started as a frightening moment at an airport baggage claim had grown into a movement for change, proof that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected moments. 6 months after the airport incident, the family gathered in their backyard for a weekend barbecue. The autumn leaves rustled gently as Mr. Thompson stood at the grill, cooking hamburgers and hot dogs. But this wasn't just any family cookout. It was a celebration of change. Among their guests were faces that would have seemed unlikely 6 months ago. The airport officers involved in the incident, now graduates of the new training program, sat chatting with FBI colleagues. The airport's chief of security was there too, watching the children play basketball with his own kids. "It's amazing how things change," Mrs. Thompson said softly to her husband as she brought out another plate of burger buns. "Remember how scared the kids were that day?" Their daughter, now president of her school's Student Rights Club, was showing some younger students her famous video on her laptop. The video had become part of a national training program used by police departments across the country. "And see here," she explained to her attentive audience, "this is why it's important to know your rights, but also to stay calm." The son, wearing his favorite basketball jersey, took a break from the game and walked over to one of the airport officers, the same one who had tried to separate him from his parents that day. But now, instead of fear, there was understanding. "Officer," he said, holding out a bottle of water, "want to join our game?" The officer smiled, accepting both the water and the invitation, understanding the deeper meaning of this simple gesture. Mr. Thompson watched this interaction from the grill, remembering how just 6 months ago, these same officers had been on the other side of a very different situation. Now, they were leading advocates for the new training program, sharing their own experiences about how that day changed their perspective. The head of airport security stood up, tapping his glass for attention. The backyard fell quiet, even the kids pausing their game. "I'd like to make a toast," he began, his voice carrying across the yard. "6 months ago, we made a terrible mistake. But this family," he gestured to the Thompsons, "they didn't just accept our apology, they helped us become better." The daughter's laptop showed the impact numbers. Over 2 million views of her video, more than 500 police departments using it in their training, and countless messages from families sharing similar experiences. But more importantly, reports of similar incidents at airports had dropped significantly. "Dad," the son called out, running over to the grill, "can Officer Mike stay for dinner? He's teaching me some basketball moves." Mr. Thompson nodded, remembering how this same officer had once tried to question his son separately. The transformation was remarkable. Mrs. Thompson joined a conversation with some mothers from the neighborhood. They were planning a community awareness program, inspired by what happened to the Thompson family. Sometimes, she told them, the worst moments can lead to the best changes. The daughter stood up to address everyone, her confidence having grown over the past months. "My video went viral," she said, "but that's not what matters. What matters is that people learned from it. Even today, I get messages from kids who say they feel safer knowing their rights." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Mr. Thompson gathered everyone for a group photo. "This is historical," he said, setting up the camera timer. "Not because of what happened 6 months ago, but because of what's happened since." In the photo, there were no clear divisions between law enforcement and civilians, no visible lines between different backgrounds or beliefs. There were just people, sharing food and laughter, united by a common goal to make things better. The son, sitting on the porch steps with his sister, watched the adults talking and laughing. "Do you think it's really fixed now?" he asked her quietly. She wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "Not everything," she replied honestly. "But we helped make it better. And sometimes that's how change happens, one family, one video, one moment at a time." As evening settled in and the porch lights came on, the backyard was filled with the warm glow of not just reconciliation, but transformation. The Thompson family had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change, proving that sometimes the best response to discrimination isn't just resistance. It's education, understanding, and the willingness to help others learn from our experiences.